Welcome, everybody, to Firehouse Talks with Jersey Rick, igniting leadership excellence. I'm Rick, and this is my co-host, Emily.
Hi, welcome back.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And our topic is disunity in the community. But as a reminder, you don't have to be a firefighter to listen to this. So if you're a first-time listener and you tune this in and say, oh, I'm not a firefighter, hey, we're talking about all things leadership related. So you do not have to be a firefighter to listen. Yep. Emily, in a previous episode, you told our listeners why this is called Firehouse Talks with Jersey Rick. Could you recap that for our new listeners, please?
Yeah, the reason we named it Firehouse Talks is when you were a battalion chief, you would visit the firehouses on occasion. A lot,
yeah, a lot,
not on occasion. And you would just sit down with the guys at the table and have a cup of coffee and talk about life and anything in the firehouse and everything in between. So that's really the reason why it's called Firehouse Talks. Like you said, it's not just for firefighters. You're just welcome to our table and grab a cup of coffee if you're sitting down, or sip some coffee on the road.
Yeah.
And we'll just talk to you.
Yeah, and that's it. Emily had a good description of that, and I asked her to repeat that because that was my habit as a battalion chief. And we had 3 shifts, A, B, and C, and I practiced that habit across all 3 of the shifts. I firmly believe that leaders need to be out with the people that are working for them and that they're working with. I like that better, working with.
Yeah.
And so just sitting down at the firehouse table with a cup of coffee and passing on official information from our chiefs meetings and anything else that came down, but then just simply getting to know them, having a cup of coffee, sharing experiences, and talking about leadership and answering their questions about leadership. So, Emily, could you tell everybody what our topic is again today?
Yeah, so today's topic is disunity in the community. That kind of rhymes.
Yeah, yes, it does rhyme.
So we're going to start off today with Psalm 133:1, which says, "Behold, how good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity."
Well, yes, unity. Right now we're about a month away from Election Day. And as we have seen, not only in the United States of America, but worldwide, there's a tremendous amount of disunity. There's a lot of disunity in the communities around the country, around the world. And so, however, we are not going to just be talking about that on a national or an international scale. We're going to be talking about this from a leadership perspective. However, I will say, listen, folks, be careful about what you're listening to, because there's a lot of people out there that are fueling disunity.
Yeah.
They love to sow discord. There's a lot of these special interest groups that are out there that are just constantly stirring people up. And hey, and that includes those folks on the news media, those of you who like to turn on the news and
the talking heads.
Yeah, the talking heads, and you like to listen to whatever it is, CNN, MSNBC, PBS, any of that stuff. There people are out there, they're stirring up discord, and don't get sucked into that stuff. Just keep in mind that the news media is there to make money, and they're making money out of chumps who are falling for all of their garbage. So be careful.
Yeah, and just pray for wisdom and discernment. I mean, one of the verses I absolutely love, I think it's in John 8, says, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free."
Yeah.
So pray that God will show you the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So moving on, Emily.
Yeah. So let's ask yourself this question. Is there disunity in your team or organization? So let's move on and look at an example from our episode. So we're going to dive into a history lesson today, and we are going to go into depth on the American Civil War.
Yes, and to give you background information, because you need to know this, so it ties into the ultimate example that we're going to be speaking about, is conflict between 2 generals at the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. So armed conflict had been brewing for a number of years, ever since the early days of the colonial era, and certainly throughout the formulation and then the signing of the Constitution. And this had been brewing, and it was brewing over the slavery issue. And it came to a head in April of 1861 when Confederate forces in South Carolina fired on the Union fort, the federal fort of Fort Sumter. And after that, bloody battles were waged on the soils of America from that point all the way up until April 1865, when the Civil War came to an end. A lot of Americans died during the Civil War. And I could guarantee you there's a lot more that happened to the Civil War than what people read in their history books. That's a page, maybe a page and a half at the most.
Absolutely. So this was a very rough time for the Union Army of the Potomac. And hadn't they gone through more than one general since the outbreak of the war as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so within the Union Army itself, the overall Union Army, there was the Army of the Potomac, and then there were Western armies as well. But I don't want to get bogged down in that. So yes, there was a rough time for the Army of the Potomac. They went through General George McClellan, which President Lincoln ultimately wound up cashiering. And after that, General Ambrose Burnside. And he had his issues and he had his problems. And then Fighting Joe Hooker, he became the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac. And then it wound up with Major General George G. Meade, which we'll get into a little bit of that and how he took command of the Union Army of the Potomac.
So that's the Union Army, but what about the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia? I believe they were commanded by General Robert E. Lee. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. But he was not in command initially. And just as a background, Lee had been asked to take command of the Union armies, but he turned it down because state loyalties during that period of the Civil War were much stronger than what they are now. And Lee stayed loyal to Virginia, and he resigned his commission from the Army. However, the Confederate General Joseph Johnston was the commanding officer of those Confederate forces, and he was wounded in the Peninsula Campaign in June of 1862. And that's when Robert E. Lee took command. So as I mentioned earlier, this episode here really is going to be talking about narrowing it down in this disunity of the community, disunity in the community of the Army of the Potomac between two key generals.
So we are going to be specifically talking about the Battle of the Gettysburg campaign of June and July of 1863.
Correct.
So what happened prior to Gettysburg?
Okay, now folks, this is important. Don't tune us out and say I'm not interested in history, because what happened prior in end of April, beginning of May 1863 is key to this conflict that is going to take place later on in July between two of these generals. Fighting Joe Hooker was the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac, and they were fighting in Virginia at the Battle of Chancellorsville. And essentially, they got whipped on by the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. Now, according to the American Battlefield Trust, despite heavy casualties, including the mortal wounding of General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson on the Confederate side, Chancellorsville has been considered Lee's greatest military victory. Now, there was a lot of, essentially, I'll call it whining and crying amongst the Union generals, the commanding generals, prior to this, saying that the Confederate forces had more people, we need more reinforcements, so on and so forth, like that. Now, another player in this was Hooker's chief of staff, named Daniel Butterfield. And here we go. Here's one of the key players now that we're going to be talking about in this conflict. His name is Daniel Sickles. He was the commanding general of the Union Third Corps at Chancellorsville, and as it Chancellorsville. And then as the decision was made through the Confederate leadership to invade Pennsylvania. So it's the second invasion of the North. The first one had taken place in 18 1862.
Mhm.
And Antietam on September 17th, 1862 was the bloodiest day
Yeah.
in American history. So a decision was made, hey, the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia is going to invade Pennsylvania. Reasons being is they wanted to take the war out of Virginia. The Virginia citizens had suffered quite a bit. And then also over in Mississippi, General Grant and his Union forces were pushing in on the Confederates in Vicksburg along the Mississippi River. And so they wanted to draw them out. And so a lot of folks who have visited Gettysburg, they only envision this as happening on July 1, 2, and 3 of 1863, but the campaign itself began on June 3 of 1863, and then it ended on July 14th, 1863, because they had to move out of Virginia, go into Pennsylvania. Then the Union Army had to follow them, which there was a whole different story there that we don't have time for right now. And so it's quite a bit. There's a lot of leadership lessons that can be learned from this campaign. And I'd say more than likely at some point in our future, we're going to be delving into them because we can all learn from these. So that's just a brief synopsis of what had happened prior to Gettysburg and the movement of the Confederate forces north.
So there was a lot of disunity in the
Mhm.
community of the Army of the Potomac, is what it sounds like. They were fighting the enemy, but also each other.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a lot of differing personalities in there. And what folks often do not understand is all of these officers, these generals, colonels, captains, majors, lieutenants, not all of them were West Point graduates. Many of them were political appointees.
Mm, yeah. So you mentioned Daniel Sickles earlier. So let's talk about him. Like, what's the background of him?
He had a very nefarious background. He was born in 1819, studied law at New York University, entered politics. He was part of the infamous Tammany Hall Democrats. At age 28, he became secretary of the legation in London, and then he became a senator and a congressman from 1857 to 1861. But one of the things with Sickles is he was certainly an unethical and immoral man. He was known for being a womanizer. And on February 27, 1859, in Lafayette Park, across the street from the White House in Washington, D.C., Sickles shot and killed the district attorney for Washington, who was none other than Philip Barton Key. Francis Scott Key.
I was just wondering.
Yes, Francis Scott Key, who penned the Star Spangled Banner.
Yeah.
Well, Philip was his son. And he killed him because apparently, Philip there was having an affair with Sickles' wife, Sickles the womanizer. He went to trial, and he was the first time in American history that the temporary insanity plea was used, and it was successful.
Wow.
And Sickles' lawyer was none other than Edwin Stanton, who went on to become the Secretary of War in Lincoln's cabinet. So at the outbreak of the war, Sickles started to form a regiment. He brought together volunteers and he formed the Excelsior Brigade. Excuse me, I said regiment. That should have been brigade. So for those of you Civil War enthusiasts out there, I stand corrected. It was a brigade. And on September 3, 1861, he was elevated to the rank of brigadier general. He was a political general. He never went to West Point. He never had any military training whatsoever. And then over the next couple of years, he was elevated to division command and then ultimately to corps command. And that's what he was performing at when they were fighting down in Chancellorsville in Virginia.
That's so interesting. So he literally had no military previous experience.
No. And there was a lot of generals on both sides, Confederate and Union, that had no military experience. They were political appointees.
So let's talk about George G. Meade and what his background was in contrast.
Yeah, in contrast, General Meade was a professional soldier. He's from Philadelphia. He's a West Point graduate, fought in the Mexican-American War. He also surveyed a number of coastal areas in the United States and involved in building lighthouses. At the time of Chancellorsville, which we just talked about, he was the commanding general of the Fifth Corps. And as things unfolded between Fighting Joe Hooker, General Halleck, the commanding general of the armies of the Union, and Abraham Lincoln, essentially they got kind of tired of Fighting Joe's kicking and hollering and screaming and his threatening resignation, and they accepted. And that's when Meade became the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac. How he found out is a very interesting story. He was woken up in the middle of the night on June 28th by a courier that came out of Washington, D.C. and said, "You are now the man. You are now the commanding general."
Wow.
And he had to go out actually and tell Hooker that you've been relieved of command. And again, there's a lot that's associated with this from a leadership perspective. But he had to retain Daniel Butterfield as his chief of staff, which ultimately turned out to be an enemy. And then also because the one that Meade wanted turned it down. Meade despised Sickles. Meade did not like the volunteer generals. He did not like the political appointee generals, and he despised them. He felt that Sickles was a immoral, unethical politician who had been elevated to his position simply because of his political ties. So right then and there, this is going on. And Sickles knows that Meade doesn't like him.
Yeah. So right there, you already have the disunity. You have such contrastive backgrounds.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
And a lack of respect on both sides.
Right. And on the same team.
Wow. So that is their background. Now entering into Gettysburg, what happened the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, which was the second day of the battle?
That's right, Emily. Ultimately, the Union forces caught up with the Confederate forces. And on July 1st, combat broke out on the western side of Gettysburg and in the northern portions of Gettysburg above the town. Union forces were pushed through the town and took up positions on East Cemetery Hill, and extended down through Cemetery Ridge. And some of our listeners may be familiar with what has been referred to as the Union fishhook. So now on July 2nd, after the Union had been pushed back, they've got some very strong positions. And the Third Corps, under Sickles' command, came onto the field late the night before, and General Meade ordered them to take up positions on Cemetery Ridge to anchor on the Second Corps' left and extend south along the ridge to the Round Tops. Now, Daniel, being Daniel, didn't like this position, and he felt like he should be further west than where he was at. So he decided to move the Third Corps west to the Emmitsburg Road. This was done without permission. Now, Sickles was summoned to a meeting at Meade's headquarters twice, and he didn't come. Eventually, General Meade rode out to Sickles to confront him about what had taken place. And then it was too late because the Confederates had launched their attack on the afternoon of July the 2nd.
Wow. So what was the result of this disunity in the community?
Now, it's very difficult from what I've studied, Emily, and as you know, I have studied the Gettysburg campaign for a number of years, and just prior to starting recording this episode here, you were commenting on the number of books that I have.
I was, yes. We think it's over 108.
Yes.
A little fun fact.
Yeah, the people who listen probably saying, "Wow, are you kidding me?" No, and Emily's serious, and so
been to Gettysburg multiple times.
Yes, been on the field. Been on the field multiple times as well. And there's so much that we can learn. So what is the result of this disunity in the community? I've not been able to determine, and I'm not sure anybody could, how many additional casualties took place that day because of what Sickles did. And Sickles pushed his Third Corps out towards the Emmitsburg Road. Matter of fact, General Hancock, the commanding general of the Union's Army of the Potomac Second Corps, where Sickles was supposed to anchor on his left, when they moved out, the Third Corps moved out, Hancock made the comment that, well, how well formed they look, but he said, but they'll be coming back in short order. So at any rate, the Third Corps that afternoon sustained 4,103 casualties, including killed, wounded,
Wow.
and missing. Sickles himself was wounded in the leg near the Trossel farm. He was hit by a solid shot and ultimately lost that leg, left the field, and Third Corps was turned over to another general. Now, where I was saying, through my research, it's very, very difficult to determine that had Sickles stayed where he was supposed to stay, what the casualty rate would be. That's very difficult to say. But also, the Fifth Corps, Meade's former corps, was involved in a lot of fighting that afternoon as well around Little Round Top. They sustained 2,143 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing.
Wow.
So
what happened during the afternoon, specifically at Little Round Top?
Or along that,
or just in the
yeah,
afternoon in
that
general?
afternoon there was a violation of Meade's commander's intent, and we talked about commander's intent in one of our episodes here earlier this year, and that's essentially, the commander says, this is what I want you to do, and here's the ditch banks, and you can function with inside of those.
So wasn't Sickles insubordinate then?
I believe he was.
Yeah.
I believe he was. And there's a lot of debate out there. One of the podcasts I listened to is called the Gettysburg Campaign. And, those two gentlemen have talked about Sickles a lot. But, coming out of the military and certainly the fire service myself, is those were the orders, and Sickles did not obey those orders. And so, just as a reminder, the official definition of commander's intent is a device designed to help subordinates understand the larger context of their actions and allows subordinates to exercise judgment and initiative to depart from the original plan when the unforeseen occurs in a way that is consistent with higher commanders' aims. Sickles, when Meade went out, asked, am I authorized to move my corps as I see fit? And Meade said, certainly within the limits of the general instructions I have given you. Any ground within those limits you may choose to occupy, I leave to you. So his limits were, Sickles, anchor your corps on the left of the Second Corps and extend south to the Round Tops. That was it. That was it. And Sickles could deploy his corps as he saw fit within those limits, but he did not.
So basically, dislike and disunity created friction amongst Meade and Sickles, causing Sickles to make that terrible decision, which could have impacted his life, but he lost his leg. And so many lives of others.
It impacted the lives of others. So, we have to ask these questions, folks. What impact does disunity, dislike, and friction have on team dynamics? And what impact does disunity, dislike, and friction have on decision making, which we saw right here, right now? Is, had there been, a mutual respect amongst these men, that Sickles, I'm a politician, I'm a lawyer, so that says a lot right there. Sickles would have obeyed Meade's command and anchored where he was supposed to anchor.
And then the other questions is, what impact does disunity, dislike, and friction have on attitudes?
Yes.
Ooh, that's a toughie. And what impact does disunity, dislike, and friction have on subordinates?
Yes, let me start over that one. Sickles was subordinate to Meade. And when you've got that dislike, distrust, disunity, friction that is taking place, it does have an impact. And folks, think back to times when you've seen this in your organization or in your life, and the impacts it's had on you, the impacts it's had on your organization. Now, unless you're functioning, in the military, dislike, disunity, and friction is not going to create a loss of 4,000 and some casualties and missing in action, killed in action. But there's a lot of other fallout that comes with that. When there's so much, distrust and discontent and hate that exists in an organization.
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, in your book, The Furnace of Leadership Development, which I had a quick plug, is
Yes.
also available on Amazon for purchase and on Audible, an
Audible, yes.
audiobook. In chapter 4, you talked about this an unhealthy team conflict.
I did, and I did talk about this example a little bit because there's a lot that's associated with this. But I started off with a statement that I've heard over the years, and not only in our department, but from other firefighters in other departments. And it's like, well, we may not get along in the firehouse, yeah, but we get the job done. Yeah, you might get the job done, but how efficiently is the job getting done? When there's disunity in the community, how efficient is the job getting done? And the example I gave from the fire service is when my friend and I, we were taking pictures of fire trucks. That was our hobby. And we visited a fire station in another area, a completely, totally different area. And they were experiencing a merger. Two fire departments were merging together. We rang the doorbell, and the captain and the firefighter came to the door, and it was the other fire department's station. It was the other fire department's rig with their logo, their name, their color on the rig. The captain and the firefighter were from the larger fire department that was merging the smaller one. And they had on their badge from their previous department and the patch. We introduced ourselves, said what we were there for. They were friendly to us, and they said, we'll get the driver. That's his truck. Just like that. And they went off. And a minute or two later, this other guy shows up, and he was from the smaller fire department, the one that was being absorbed by the larger one. And he had on the badge and the patch from that smaller department. He was friendly to us as well. But he went on to tell us what life was like in that firehouse for him. Those other two guys would not talk to him unless it was in the line of duty. He said, this is the first time that you guys that anybody's talked to me today.
Wow.
And they won't even ask for my input on what to eat. He said they won't even let me eat with them. That's what kind of hate and discontent was existent right then at that time. Now this was in the later 90s, folks. And I'm happy to say that I've seen that department, that merger was ultimately successful. And some things had to occur higher up at political levels to make it successful. But that there's no way you're going to tell me that they won't talk to this guy, that's not having an impact on their efficiency and in how the business is being carried out, because there's no trust. There was no trust that existed between any of them. So yes, that was, that was there in the book. So I asked the question, hey, folks, what about you? What about your team?
Yeah. Is there disunity in the community?
Is there disunity in your community?
Is there unhealthy team conflict going on?
Hey, I said unhealthy team conflict. Not all conflict is unhealthy. Conflict doesn't have to be a throw down, knockout, drag out fight. Conflict can happen, and it can be healthy conflict. And that's actually how organizations grow. So if there is that unhealthy conflict, what steps can you take to eliminate it or to start to get rid of it? And listen, you've heard me say this before. If you're listening, don't cop out and say that's not, I'm off my pay grade. Listen, at the individual level, what can you do to create a healthy team environment?
Yeah. What
can we do as individuals? That's a question you ask. You say, Rick, I'm not sure what I can do. Well, yeah, hey, here in a minute, we're going to tell you how you can reach out and contact us. So we're not going to leave you hanging with this on that last question exactly, because in episode 19, we're going to dig into this a little bit more about creating team unity. But in the meantime, hey, feel free to reach out to me. In the show notes is a link to my website, fireofficerleadershipacademy.com. My email is in there. You can reach out to me and you can learn about the services that I provide. And also, as a reminder, I've got my weekly leadership blog posted up on my website and also out there on LinkedIn for the firefighters in the audience. If you're on Facebook, I've got a Facebook group specifically for firefighters, retired or active, volunteer or paid, wildland or ARF, military, and it's called the Firefighter Leadership Network. Look it up and join. So, Emily, that's about it for now. Do you have any final thoughts before we close this episode?
I don't think so. I look forward to digging into this further in episode 19.
Okay, well, thank you, Emily, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in and listening to us today on Firehouse Talks with Jersey Rick, igniting leadership excellence. So long.
Bye.